Yes. Go ahead, man. Okay. Well, we'll do it this way. So, take out some notes. We're going to talk through this as we go. When we left, the last thing we discussed was what was going on in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. Okay. In Matthew 5 through 7, we get Jesus looking like the prophet Moses to some extent, giving law and doing some teaching. Okay, Sermon on the Mount. The core set of what Jesus wants to communicate in the Sermon on the Mount, at least the argument for me is, what he wants to communicate is this idea of righteousness. Okay? So in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is primarily concerned with righteousness. He wants us to know what it is. He wants us to see how it applies. He wants us to prioritize it, etc., etc., etc. That is part of what is going on, or what I think is the main thing that is going on in the Sermon on the Mount. Now, Jesus will illustrate that in a number of ways. The primary way we looked at it before we left for break was Jesus talking about, you have heard it said, but now I tell you. And Jesus takes something that started in the law with Moses, and then he tweaks it. He doesn't change the command, he doesn't nullify it, but he makes it different, and he makes it more complicated. Right? He says, you've heard it said, don't commit murder. But now I tell you, you get angry with somebody and you lash out at them, you've got the same problem. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery. But if you do this in your heart, you've got the same problem. He says, you want to be pious and upright, then don't pray to be seen and admired by people. Go into the quiet space and pray there. Don't give to the poor to earn the favor of those around you. Instead, be genuinely concerned with their well-being and do it in private. Okay. These are all illustrations of how this righteousness works, and they revolve around a core idea, and the idea is this: love for God and love for others. Righteousness for Jesus is ultimately about how we love God and how we love others. And the bottom line is this: if you love God, then you're going to do the things that Jesus is talking about, because they come out of a love for God, who said this is the right way to go ahead and do these things. In addition to that, if you love others, then you will also avoid things like the murder and the adultery and the fill in the blank, because you love them, and so will not mistreat those individuals. You with me so far? That concept, everything else in the teachings of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew sort of revolve around. Love for God, love for neighbor, and this core idea of righteousness. Everything else sort of hovers around that concept. It's an application of it, it's an expansion of it, it's a clarification on it, let me give you more details about it, but it all centers around that idea. As the gospel moves forward, the story shifts. And in Matthew 8 through 10, we get a series of miracle stories and events in the life of Jesus. And Jesus is interacting with the world around him. And then in 11 through 13, we get a series of teaching moments interspersed in events in the life of Jesus. And in both major sections, 8 through 10 and 11 through 13, we get the same basic setup. And it looks like this. Jesus does or says or interacts with his world in a particular way, and those who follow Jesus press into what Jesus is doing. They ask questions, typically. So, for example, Matthew chapter 8, Jesus is asleep on the boat. He's in the back, taking a nap. It's late, he's tired. There's a storm. Jesus is sleeping through the thunderstorm on the sea. I don't sleep through a thunderstorm in my own house. Forget about it on a fishing boat. Jesus, however, is taking a nap. It must be a huge benefit to be God, to be able to just pass out wherever you want. Just saying, because I couldn't. I'm too light asleep. He's asleep on the back of the boat. They go and wake him up. He says, "Be still." The wind and the waves stop. The storm is over. And the disciples ask a question. Who is this? He speaks. The wind listens. What is going on? They ask a question. The following story, Jesus is healing somebody, and the Pharisees basically tell him, "You can't do that." The disciples press into what Jesus is doing. The Pharisees reject it. The disciples ask questions. They pursue it. Hey, what is this about? Let me learn more about this. Pharisees, on the other hand, "You can't do that." Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath. The Pharisees, "You can't do that." Some friends bring a man who's paralyzed to Jesus, and he says, "Your sins are forgiven." And the Pharisees, "You can't do that." Meanwhile, the disciples are going, "Wait, hold on, explain this." This is the trend now in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus will do something, he will teach something, he will say something, and someone will say, "Wait, what is that? Who are you?" Like in the genuine asking the question, "I want to know more about this" sense. Or somebody will look at him and say, "You can't do that." And what Matthew is doing as the gospel unfolds is saying, how are you going to respond? Are you going to pursue it, or are you going to reject it? Because those are the only two options. You either press into it or you run away from it. Those are the only two options in the Gospel of Matthew. The events in 8 through 10 then become the same basic setup for 11 through 13. And in this series of teaching moments in 11 through 13, the disciples ask questions, especially in chapter 13. Hey, you told this parable about this guy sowing seed in the ground, and then what are you talking about? They ask questions. Jesus teaches. They ask questions. Why do you teach us in parables? Why don't you just explain it in normal people talk? Jesus says, well, here's why. He explains it. They still don't get it, but he explains it. Pharisees, on the other hand, blow them off. Because you have two choices here. You either press into what Jesus is doing, or you reject what Jesus is doing. And so the same question, how do we respond to Jesus, is asked again. But now it's got this extra layer, because you've just read through these different stories of Jesus doing some sort of miracle. So now you're stuck with this. If I buy into the miracles, I should probably buy into the teaching. And that's exactly what Matthew is getting you to. If you take Jesus on face value for the miracles he does, then you have to accept and deal with what he's teaching you. And if you buy into what he's teaching, then you have to accept the legitimacy of the miracle. They go together. You can't pull those two things apart. If you reject one of them, you're going to end up rejecting the other one. Because there isn't a single character in the Gospel of Matthew who rejects one of them but accepts the other one. You with me on this? This and what happens in 13 is all set up by the 5 chapters that lead up to it. Right? Because moment after moment after moment after moment in the gospel is one illustration or another of how somebody is responding to what Jesus is doing or teaching. With me? Okay. That means then there should be something rather important about what's happening in Matthew 13. Ironically enough, most of what's going on in the parables of Matthew 13 are exactly about how we respond when we're confronted with the truth about the kingdom of heaven. What kind of soil are you? Will you give up everything to gain the treasure or the pearl? Right? Here's what we are going to do in here today. First, you're going to go to the Power School page for the Gospel of Matthew. My class, Power School, Gospel of Matthew page. Bottom left, there's a video. Bible Project, Matthew 1 through 13. First half of the Gospel of Matthew. I want you to watch that video. It's like 8 minutes long. When you're done with the video, I want you to go to Matthew 13. You need to read Matthew 13 and then answer the discussion post that goes with it in Power School. Okay? Good there. The discussion post in Power School is open until Friday. So save progress outside of Power School to make sure you still have it. And then just put it all in the discussion post before Friday when you're ready to submit. Okay? We're going to talk more about the parables specifically tomorrow as we work through this. Okay? Video. Once the video's done, read Matthew 13. After you've read Matthew 13, go ahead. Then do the discussion in Power. What's up?